Have you ever heard of a cat that could predict death? Sounds like something out of a movie, doesn't it? At Steer House, a nursing home, a cat named Oscar did something unbelievable. He wasn't the most affectionate, nor the most sociable. But when he chose a patient to lie beside, something inevitable happened. Hours later, that person would pass away. Coincidence? An instinct only he possessed? Or something far beyond human understanding? This is the story of the cat that defied science and left the world in awe. The Steer House Nursing and Rehabilitation Center was a quiet place, filled with stories and memories. Wide hallways, walls adorned with photographs from the past, the scent of coffee mixed with a faint hint of disinfectant. The atmosphere was both comforting and melancholic. Among the dedicated nurses and elderly residents who carried decades of memories, a few therapy cats lived there. They had been adopted to bring comfort to the residents, to warm lonely hearts. Oscar was one of them. A rescued kitten, small and unassuming, who soon stood out, not for his affection, but for the strange distance he kept from everyone. While the other cats sought out cuddles and playtime, Oscar merely observed. His sharp eyes seemed to analyze everything around him. He walked silently through the hallways, pausing in front of certain doors, hesitating, and then moving on. No one paid much attention to it. Until the day he chose his first patient. It all started subtly, almost unnoticed. Oscar entered a resident's room, jumped onto the bed, and curled up beside the elderly patient. A common thing for a cat to do, right? But that night, the patient passed away. The staff thought it was just a coincidence. But then, it happened again. Days later, another patient, another quiet moment, and once again, Oscar was there, lying beside them. A few hours later, another farewell. That was when a nurse, hesitant, spoke up. Have you noticed that Oscar is always around when someone passes away? At first, they laughed. It seemed like an absurd idea. But as the cases continued to pile up, the feeling that this wasn't just a coincidence started to grow. Oscar never got it wrong. When he chose a resident, their fate seemed sealed. Time passed, and Oscar's mystery became impossible to ignore. The staff began watching him more closely. And when Oscar curled up beside a patient, they already knew what to do. They called the family, urging them to come and say their goodbyes. It didn't take long for even the doctors to accept Oscar's gift. He became a silent messenger, a quiet signal that time was running out. But what was most remarkable wasn't just his accuracy, it was his presence. Oscar didn't just predict death. He stayed with each patient until their final moment. He never moved, never grew restless. He simply remained there, as if ensuring that no one would leave this world alone. Some feared his presence. Others saw him as a silent angel. But the question remained, how did he know? Doctors tried to find explanations. Some believed that Oscar could detect chemical changes in the human body, perhaps a subtle scent that signaled the approach of death. Others thought he sensed shifts in body temperature or breathing patterns. But if it were something that simple, why didn't any other cat do the same? Oscar seemed to know something no one else did. For some, it was science. For others, something spiritual. But regardless of the explanation, one thing was certain: when Oscar chose to stay by someone's side, that moment became something truly special. Everything changed with the arrival of an elderly man at Steer House. His name was Benjamin Carter. He carried the weight of time in his eyes. Unlike many residents, he didn't arrive frail or against his will. Benjamin had been a man who lived alone for years, a lover of literature who dedicated his life to words and stories. A retired literature professor, the kind who spoke with passion about every sentence, every book, as if they were portals to other worlds. But age, as it does to all, arrived without asking permission. His health began to decline, his once steady hands trembled as he held a book. The pages weren't as easy to turn anymore, and his eyes took longer to move across each line. His daughter didn't have time to care for him, so, with few options, she brought him to Steer House. The nursing home became his last home, a place where time seemed to pass more slowly, where the stories he loved were no longer told as often. But Benjamin never complained. He simply watched, as if collecting the stories of others now. His room was lined with old books, many of them filled with scribbled notes in the margins. To him, every mark, every underlined phrase, was a piece of himself left behind. And it was among these books and memories that Oscar appeared for the first time. The nursing staff was certain that with Oscar's presence, Benjamin had only a few hours left, just like every other patient the cat had chosen. But then days passed. Weeks. Even months. And Benjamin remained. At first, the old man barely noticed the cat. Oscar was a silent shadow, slipping in and out without drawing attention. But little by little, his presence became constant. He began curling up near Benjamin's armchair, watching him like an attentive student. "Come to listen to my stories, little one," Benjamin once joked, closing a book on his lap. Oscar, as always, didn't answer. He just sat there, still, his golden eyes reflecting the soft glow of the fading afternoon light. The nurses began to notice their unlikely friendship. Unlike the other therapy cats that moved from lap to lap seeking affection, Oscar had chosen Benjamin as his silent companion. Always there, listening to his readings, attuned to the old man's slow movements. Their bond became a ritual. Every day, Benjamin picked up a book, adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began to read. Oscar stayed by his side, a loyal listener. It didn't matter what story it was, whether Benjamin read aloud or just to himself, Oscar was always there. Over time, Benjamin began speaking to him. He shared memories, recited poetry, asked questions he never expected answers to. But deep down, he knew Oscar understood. Months went by, and life at Steer House continued as usual. But something in Benjamin began to change. First, he read less. Then, he spent more time sitting by the window, gazing at the sky as if trying to memorize every detail. His short walks down the halls became rarer, and his smiles slowly faded. Oscar noticed before anyone else. He started spending even more time by Benjamin's side. If before he came and went as he pleased, now he never left the room. He didn't purr, didn't ask for affection, he just waited. Benjamin, with his experienced gaze, understood. And unlike many, he wasn't afraid. Autumn arrived at Steer House with the cold wind whispering through the windows. Golden leaves piled up in the corners of the garden, and the late afternoon light cast long shadows in the hallways. It was that season when everything seemed to slow down, as if time stretched itself a little before winter. Benjamin Carter no longer read as he used to. The books, his lifelong companions, now rested untouched on the table beside his armchair. His eyes, which once raced across pages with such vibrancy, now spent more time gazing at something invisible beyond the window. But Oscar was still there. Always there. That night, the routine at Steer House was interrupted by something no one would ever forget. The clock had already passed 10 when a night nurse, walking down the silent hallway, noticed something unusual. Benjamin's room, usually shrouded in darkness at that hour, was illuminated. Curious, she approached, feeling a chill for no apparent reason. Peeking through the slightly open door, she saw something that made her hold her breath. Benjamin, sitting on the edge of his bed, held an open book in his trembling hands. He was reading. But this was no ordinary reading. His voice, weakened by time, echoed softly through the room, slow and deliberate, as if each word carried a weight of its own. The words came out with emotion, filled with meaning, as he recited a poem that he seemed to know by heart. And Oscar sat right in front of him, staring intently at the elderly man, as if understanding every word. The nurse didn't have the heart to interrupt. She simply stood there, hidden in the dimly lit hallway, listening. Benjamin's voice, though frail, had a solemn, almost ritualistic tone. The poem spoke of farewells, of life's cycle, of how all stories come to an end, but never truly disappear. It was a poem by Tennyson. One about sailing beyond the horizon, unafraid of what lay ahead. And then, as the last words were spoken, a deep silence filled the room. Oscar did not move. He remained there, watching Benjamin, as if waiting for something. The nurse felt a lump rise in her throat. Something about this moment was different. This wasn't just an old man reciting poetry. This was a farewell. Benjamin smiled at Oscar, gently closed the book, and let it rest on his lap. His breathing was steady, his eyes at peace. And then, Oscar did something he had never done before. He meowed. Not just any meow. It was low, almost a whisper, as if he were responding. The sound carried through the room in an almost unreal way. The nurse, still hidden by the door, felt chills run down her spine. Oscar never meowed. He had always been there, silent, accompanying those who left without uttering a sound. But this time, he broke the silence. And then, as if satisfied, as if knowing Benjamin had said everything he needed to say, Oscar stood up, climbed onto the bed, and curled up beside the elderly man, resting his head softly on his hand. The nurse blinked, trying to push back the tears. She knew exactly what this meant. And that night, all of Steer House knew it too. Benjamin's time was running out. Are you enjoying the story so far? So, like the video and subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. The news spread through Steer House before dawn. The nurse who had witnessed the scene the night before told everyone she met, Benjamin Carter had read a poem. For those who didn't know him, that might not have seemed important. But for those who had watched his health decline day after day, that moment had been a final spark of life, a last act before the inevitable silence. And Oscar knew. From that night on, the cat never left the room. Not for a second. When the nurses came in to check Benjamin's vitals, Oscar was there, curled up beside him. When the old man's daughter arrived, her eyes brimming with tears, her voice trembling, Oscar remained there, silent, watchful. He knew. The late afternoon sunlight painted the windows in gold, casting soft shadows across the room. The sound of footsteps in the hallways felt distant, muffled by the weight of time that seemed to stand still. Benjamin no longer spoke. His breathing was slow, rhythmic, like a gentle wave retreating from the shore. His daughter held his hand tenderly, telling childhood stories, trying to fill the silence with memories, with love. And Oscar, he was simply there. The nurse who had heard him meow before still checked in from time to time, a lump in her throat. Never had a farewell felt so full of meaning. Time passed, but Oscar never moved. The sun set, giving way to the quiet darkness of night. The room remained silent, interrupted only by the soft, steady sound of Benjamin's breath. Then, sometime in the early hours, Oscar lifted his head. Something had changed. The air in the room felt suspended, as if everything around them had stopped. Benjamin's daughter, exhausted, her eyes heavy with sleep, felt a shiver run down her spine without explanation. And then, Benjamin Carter let out his final breath. It was soft, light as a page turning in the wind. His daughter squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. The nurses exchanged silent glances, filled with understanding and respect. And Oscar? Oscar stayed. For a few minutes, he remained there, still beside Benjamin. As if making sure he wasn't alone. Then, without hurry, the cat stood up. His amber eyes glowed faintly under the dim bedside lamp. He gave one last look at Benjamin, then quietly leapt off the bed. Everyone held their breath as Oscar walked toward the door. And without looking back, he disappeared into the hallways of Steer House. Everyone knew what that meant. In the days that followed, Benjamin Carter's absence was deeply felt at Steer House. His now empty room still carried the faint scent of old books, and the armchair where he spent countless afternoons remained untouched, as if waiting for him to return. But for those who paid close attention, there was another absence even more noticeable. Oscar had changed. After Benjamin's passing, the cat resumed his quiet wanderings through the hallways, just as he always had. But something about him was different. He no longer lingered in rooms. He no longer sought a warm spot to curl up beside someone. He simply watched. He would sit in the corners of the nursing home for hours, his keen eyes scanning, observing. And then, when another farewell was near, he would appear. As before, Oscar still approached patients in their final moments. He would still curl up beside them, offering his silent presence. But that was all. The connection he had with Benjamin never happened again. The nurses noticed. Some said he seemed more distant, colder. But others, those who truly observed, believed it wasn't distance at all. It was grief. Oscar had chosen Benjamin. And, in some inexplicable way, Benjamin had been the only one to choose him back. After that night, the cat never purred for anyone again. He never nestled into another's bed with the same warmth. He never stayed in a room beyond the time needed for his final watch. He had become the guardian of last moments. A silent messenger, never again a friend. Time passed, and life at Steer House carried on. New residents arrived, others departed. Oscar remained, fulfilling his quiet duty, always present when the end was near. But those who had witnessed his bond with Benjamin knew that, in some way, a part of the cat had left that night as well. And so, Oscar continued his journey, a lone guardian, offering comfort to those departing, but never again finding solace for himself. Some stories defy explanation. They challenge logic, transcend the boundaries of science, and make us question everything we think we know about life, and what comes after it. Oscar was not just a cat. He was a mystery, a silent presence who bore witness to countless farewells, offering comfort in the loneliest of moments. To some, he was an omen. To others, a guardian angel on four paws. But in the end, maybe he was simply what we all hope to be for those we love, a companion until the very last moment. His gift was never about predicting death. It was about ensuring that no one left this world alone. And of all the souls who passed through Steer House, Oscar was the one who remained. Always watching, always waiting, always ready to fulfill his quiet duty. Perhaps we will never know how he knew. Perhaps we will never understand what he saw beyond the reach of human eyes. But if there's one lesson in his story, it's this: the true meaning of life is found in the connections we make, and in the way we choose to stay, even when words are no longer needed. And so, Oscar continued his journey. A silent guardian. A quiet promise that, in life's hardest moments, no one has to be alone. If you've followed the story this far, give it a like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this.